Critical Thinking Rule 2. Unfold your ideas in a natural order. This rule is about putting an argument into a logical form, one where its logical structure is clear. You can see the argument in the right about Socrates put into this natural order, which is called the standard form of an argument. One thing about standard form is that each premise as well as the conclusion are put into grammatically separate sentences. This is to clarify the difference between each premise and the conclusion. So you can see here, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human. Those are both premises, but they're separate sentences. Another aspect of standard form is to number the premises and the conclusion. The premises are listed in a logical order. What this means is that if there is more than one step to an argument, then the premises which go on to prove another premise must go before the premise they prove. This argument that I'm using as an example only has one logical step. Those two premises both directly support the conclusion, so it does not matter which order we put them in. However, if there were other premises trying to prove premises 1 or 2, for example, if you had other premises trying to prove that all humans are mortal, then those premises would have to go before the premise all humans are mortal. In this case, we don't really need additional premises because it's pretty widely accepted that all humans are mortal and that Socrates is human. However, if you ever come to a situation where one of your premises is in doubt, then you need to prove it. And the premises you put to prove a later premise go before the premise that they prove. Finally, the conclusion is listed last, and it begins with the word therefore as a further indicator that it is indeed the conclusion. So these are the elements to putting any argument into standard form. So let's look at a sample problem. This is the same argument as on the previous slide, just arranged differently. To remind you that arguments can be expressed in multiple ways. The order of the premises and conclusion can be switched, they can be combined into one grammatical sentence, and so on. Socrates is mortal. We know this because Socrates is human and because all humans are mortal. The first step is to look for indicator words or phrases. We have two indicator words, because. Now, do they indicate a premise or a conclusion? Because is a premise indicator, so we can put the propositions that follow in blue just to indicate that they're premises. The conclusion can be identified by looking around at the other parts of the argument. Now, remember that just because a sentence or part of a sentence appears in an argument passage, it doesn't mean it's a part of the argument logically speaking. So we always have to ask ourselves when we look at another sentence in the passage of the argument, is it a part of the argument? Does it help prove the conclusion, or is it the conclusion itself? In this case, the proposition Socrates is mortal can indeed be proven by the other propositions. Socrates is human and all humans are mortal. So the logical connection between them is what proves that it is indeed a part of the argument, in this case, the conclusion. So we're going to put the argument into standard form, starting with the premises. Because both of these premises directly support the conclusion, the order doesn't matter. We could have put Socrates is human as number 2 instead of as number 1. So how do you tell if the order matters? Remember, it's only if you have more than one logical step of the argument. If some of the premises are being used to prove another premise, the premises that do the proving have to come first. So you're always starting with your basic assumptions, the things that you're not proving, you're just assuming, and then you're going on to prove other things. Now, many, if not most, arguments prove the conclusion directly, so it doesn't matter what order the premises are put in. If you have an argument of more than one logical step, then you have to put the basic premises before the premises that are being proven. A premise that's proven by prior premises is the subconclusion, and then the subconclusion will go on to prove the conclusion directly, or it will at least get closer to the conclusion by proving another premise that's used to prove the conclusion directly. So now we have our premises listed, it's time to put in our conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, we use the therefore as a further indicator of the conclusion even though we also have the rule that the conclusion is placed last when putting an argument into standard form. Let's look at another sample problem. There's no proof that man-eating aliens don't exist. Thus, man-eating aliens do exist. Are there any indicator words? The word thus is an indicator. What does it indicate, premise or conclusion? The answer is a conclusion, so we can put the proposition that follows in red. Man-eating aliens do exist, that's the conclusion. So what about premises? The first sentence of the argument is indeed a premise. There's no proof that man-eating aliens don't exist. Now every argument has to have at least one premise. So if you just had the statement man-eating aliens do exist, it would not be an argument. There has to be at least some assumption that's supposed to be evidence to prove it. So now it's time to put this argument into standard form. We start with the premise. There is no proof that man-eating aliens don't exist. And now we can add the conclusion, therefore man-eating aliens do exist. So this is the smallest argument you can have in terms of length. One premise, one conclusion. It's an invalid argument because it's an argument from ignorance, which is a type of fallacy. This is an argument that assumes that because we can't know or prove something, then something definite must be following from that logically. And the only thing that follows logically from an absence of proof is an absence of proof. We don't know one way or the other. Let's look at another sample problem. God exists because the Bible says so, and because everything the Bible says is true. So, in case you're wondering, the image on the right is an Ethiopian Orthodox icon. Let's start by looking for our indicator words. We have the word because twice. So is that a premise or conclusion indicator? It's a premise indicator. So let's look at our premises. The Bible says so, and everything the Bible says is true. So now we want to look for our conclusion. The first clause, God exists, is the conclusion of the argument because it's what it's trying to prove. It's trying to assert that the Bible says God exists, and everything the Bible says is true, therefore God exists. That's the basic idea of the argument. So now let's write that out into standard form. We start with the premises. The Bible says God exists, and everything the Bible says is true. Notice we've had to rearrange the wording slightly. The Bible says God exists, as opposed to the original wording, the Bible says so. In this case, the word so is a callback to the earlier part of the sentence. It's basically saying the Bible says God exists, which was the previous clause. What you want to do when you put an argument into standard form is to completely clarify the language. So if you have an ambiguous word or phrase, put in whatever it's supposed to be referring to. So because this argument has only one logical step, it doesn't matter what order we put the premises in. Now we just add the conclusion. Therefore, God exists. It's a separate step to evaluate this argument. Rule 2 is only about putting arguments into standard form. That's basically our analysis and interpretation of an argument. And then our evaluation is kept completely separate. There's several reasons for this. The main idea is that we want to just understand the argument. We want to analyze it, interpret it logically before we try to evaluate it. Otherwise, if we like or don't like an argument, then that could taint or bias our initial analysis and interpretation of it. In this case, though, it's worth mentioning why this argument is problematic. The Bible says God exists. Everything the Bible says is true. Therefore, God exists. It's actually a valid argument. Valid means that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So logically speaking, you might say it checks out. The problem is that the premises assume too much. So validity, being valid, is not all we care about in argument evaluation. We also care about how plausible the premises are, which we'll talk about in the next video. Next up is Rule 3, start from reliable premises. This rule allows us to evaluate the premises of an argument to see how plausible they will be to the audience it's intended for.